So yes, the Marxist approach to Indian nationalism. So this video is a continuation of the uh, first unit of the paper Nationalism in India. So with this video we will be completing the first unit, the Marxist approach and the Subaltern approach. Okay, so the first one is the Marxist approach to Indian nationalism. So the Marxist approach to Indian nationalism, initially shaped by R. Palmedut and later expanded by scholars like A.R. Desai, offers a class-based analysis of how nationalism emerged and evolved in colonial India. This school of thought explains the development of Indian nationalism as a response to the contradictions between British colonial interest and the Indian people, particularly as experienced across different economic classes. It is giving stress to the economic classes. So the first, I've divided this Marxist approach into six parts. The first one would be the colonial exploitation and nationalist response. So the Marxist thinkers argue that the principal cause of nationalism in India was the growing conflict between the interest of the Indian masses and the British colonial rulers. Colonialism had devastating economic effects, especially on agriculture, handicraft, traditional livelihoods and all. The exploitation led to mass poverty, famine, economic distress, and sparked a series of resistances and uprisings, particularly among the peasantry and working classes. So, the fifth unit of this paper, not the fifth, the fourth unit of this paper, is dealing with the social movements of the classes, peasants, tribals, workers, women, and all. Okay, just mentioned it. Yep, continuing. So, this exploitation, Marxists maintain, was not incidental but systemic, driven by imperialist finance capital and designed to benefit British business interest. The profits accumulated by the British elite and the repression of the Indian population became the underlying fuel for the nationalist sentiment. According to R. Palmerut, Indian nationalism arose not from emotional or cultural awakening alone, but from the economic and social conditions created by imperialism. The rise of Indian nationalism in this view was a product of the growth of Indian capitalism forces, which emerged in opposition to British capital. Now, the structural changes under colonialism. We discussed it in the nationalist approach as well. Sorry, yeah, in the imperialist or nationalist approach, we have discussed this. So, Marxist approach criticizes colonialism for its exploitative core. All these structural changes were brought for the exploitation purpose only, but it indirectly contributed to the growth of nationalism as well. Destruction of feudal system and a decline of the traditional caste hierarchies, emergence of capitalist mode of production, it introduced factory work and urban migration, then development of modern infrastructure including the railway, telegraph, postal codes, centralized administrative and legal system, then yeah, then we have this centralized governance and all. Okay, so these transformations played a dual role. One was helping the British for the exploitation, and the second was indirectly helping in the emergence of nationalism, contributing to the idea of India as a single economic and political entity. Now, the role of press and education. The introduction of modern education, partly by the British but also promoted by Indian reformers, enabled the growth of a new educated class. This class, often referred to as clerks or babus, became the first generation of nationalist intellectuals. Through their writings, activism, and leadership, they helped disseminate ideas of national identity, political reform, and resistance to colonial rule. Professor Irfan Habib elaborates that economic unification, the spread of modern communication technologies, and the rise of public sphere through education and the press contributed significantly to the formation of Indian national consciousness. It all helped Indians to perceive themselves as a part of a common national project. The writings of early nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt highlighted the economic exploitation under colonialism and helped create a shared understanding among Indians about their common suffering and shared aspirations. Okay, now the class dynamics. Marxist scholars maintain that while nationalism became a mass movement, it was largely led and shaped by Indian bourgeois, a class that had its own interest in opposing British domination. The Congress Party in particular is viewed by Marxists as the political platform of emerging Indian capitalist class. They argue that the Congress leadership, made up of lawyers, landowners, industrialists, and professionals, often channeled the discontent of the poor into controlled, non-violent, and constitutional methods of protest. These methods, they argue, were designed to protect elite interests while preventing the movement from becoming too radical or revolutionary. According to R. Palme, their increasing economic competition with the British bourgeois compelled them to demand Swaraj as a means to expand their own capitalist enterprises free from the British economic dominance. Now the fifth is the peasant and working class struggles. So the Marxist historians pay special significant uh, attention to peasant uprisings, worker strikes, and grassroots struggles during colonial rule. They highlight the mass character of resistance movements that predated and ran parallel to the mainstream nationalist movements. These include local rebellions, anti-tax agitations, protest against indigo farming, land tenure laws, forced labor and all. While the mainstream nationalist leadership often distanced itself from these spontaneous movements, Marxists regards them as a crucial expression of class struggle and proto-nationalism. So the Congress is accused of uh, co-opting or sidelining these struggles to maintain the moderate character of the national movement and preserve elite dominance. Okay. Now the criticisms for Marxist approach. It overemphasizes the class conflict, neglecting the cultural, religious, and emotional dimensions. Bipin Chandra and other historians have argued that it conflated the national leadership with the bourgeois, ignoring their diverse social and ideological backgrounds. Marxists are also said to misinterpret the non-violent strategy of the nationalist movement as a bourgeois act, overlooking the ethical and mass-based appeal of Gandhian politics. The Marxist analysis is sometimes dismissive of spiritual or moral motivations behind mass mobilization, such as religious reform, cultural revivalism, or civilizational pride. So we can conclude that the Marxist approach to Indian nationalism provides a rigorous and materialist interpretation of how colonial exploitation and internal class dynamics shaped the freedom struggle. It is especially insightful in explaining the economic foundations of nationalism and the role of different classes, particularly the bourgeois, in shaping the character and trajectory of the movement. However, by focusing primarily on economic interest and class contradictions, it may undervalue the emotional, cultural, and ideological unity that also fuels the national movement. While it exposes the limitations and compromises of elite leadership, it sometimes understates the genuine popular aspirations for freedom, justice, and dignity that animated millions of Indians across all classes. So, we see that this approach contributes a critical and essential dimension to the understanding of Indian nationalism, but must be balanced with cultural, social, and political perspectives to grasp the full complexity of the movement. So, the last approach of this unit is the subaltern approach, which is very important. Okay, just a second. So, subaltern approach, it means the movements led by the marginalized people. So, the subaltern approach builds its framework on Gramscian concepts, particularly regarding power, state control, and hegemony. Okay, uh, Antonio Gramsci. Okay, but this was developed by Ranajit Guha and Subaltern Studies Collective, 1982. Okay, so this Subaltern Studies Collective was initiated by Ranajit Guhe and included scholars like Parth Chatterjee and Sumit Sarkar. They aimed to rewrite the history of Indian nationalism by shifting focus from elites to the marginalized and oppressed groups such as peasants, tribal women, Dalits, tribals, women, Dalits. Okay. So, the subaltern approach challenges all others, nationalist, colonial, Marxist narratives. It asserts that history had been written from the perspective of elites. Subaltern historians argue that dominant narratives ignored or misrepresented the political actions and perspectives of the oppressed. While while the elite figures like Nehru and Gandhi were highlighted in the nationalist history, the subaltern school focused on how common people resisted and influenced the course of nationalism in their own ways. So here the people's politics is focused. The autonomous political actions of the subaltern classes, peasant revolts, tribal uprisings, local resistance. This approach recognizes their active participation in the shaping history. These actions were often outside the framework of organized elite movements like National Congress, but were significant expressions of resistance. Ranajit Guha proposed the idea of a structurally split domain of politics, meaning elite and subaltern political arenas functioned independently. While elites negotiated with colonial rulers using legal methods, the subalterns engaged in spontaneous and radical forms of resistance rooted in their daily struggles. Using Gramsci's ideas, the subaltern approach claimed that Indian elites tried to establish moral authority over the people and replace British rulers, not necessarily to end domination, but to assume it to themselves. This led to a passive revolution where change was orchestrated without fundamentally altering the existing power hierarchies. Subaltern scholars questioned the glorification of Congress-led movements, arguing that they often marginalized grassroots revolts uh, and localized struggles. They claimed that elites, including landlords, industrialists, using nationalism to serve their own interests and consolidate power. Subaltern historians expanded the scope of history to include subjects like colonial law, prison, disease, memory, and gender. This allowed for a more holistic and grounded understanding of how colonialism and nationalism impacted the broader population. Ranajit Guha wrote, "The politics of the people was autonomous, not derived from elite leadership. Subaltern groups offered, shaped and transformed nationalist struggles, defying elite leadership and adapting movements to their own local goals and traditions." Partha Chatterjee examined how elites sought to control the narrative of modernity and nationalism while simultaneously creating a divide between public and private domains. Now the limitations. It overemphasized the division. Ignored the movements where elite and mass movements did converge. Okay. Also, this approach was too academic and failed to connect with the broader audiences or current political realities. So they are underplayed. So this subaltern approach is criticized for underplaying collective national unity. So we can conclude that this approach has redefined the understanding of Indian nationalism by highlighting the agency of marginalized groups and questioning dominant narratives centered on elite actors. So it provides a bottom-up perspective of history. Now let's see a quick recollection of what we studied. Nationalist approach, key thinkers, Bipin Chandra, Dadabhai Navroji, Tilak, Nehru, Gandhi. Core belief was India was a nation in the making that developed through resistance to colonialism with mass movements led by prominent leaders. Focus was in unity in diversity, mass mobilization under elite leadership, gradual rise of national consciousness. Criticism is overemphasized on elite leadership. Okay, you can note them. Then imperialist approach, key thinkers, British administrators, E.H. Carr, L.F. Rushbrook, Williams and all. The British created a unified India through their colonial rule, bringing infrastructure, governance and modernization. British positive contributions to India's development and administrative unification of the country helped in this nationalism and all. Criticism, this view justifies colonialism, underplays India's pre-colonial unity and ignores the negative impacts of British exploitation. Okay. Colonial approach it's not in the syllabus. If required, you can note them down. Okay. Then Marxist approach, R. Palmedut, A.R. Desai, Irfan Habib. Nationalism in India arose as a result of class struggle driven by the economic exploitation of the masses under British rule. Focus on economic exploitation, class contradiction, role of the bourgeois in the leading movement. Criticism, overemphasis on class analysis and role of bourgeois, which neglects cultural and emotional aspect of the movement. Then we have subaltern approach, key thinkers, Ranajit Guha, Parth Chatterjee, Sumit Sarkar. Core belief, nationalism should be studied from the perspective of marginalized groups, peasants, tribals, women, untouchables rather than elite leadership. Focus was on popular revolts, peasant uprisings, everyday resistance, history of the dispossessed. Criticism, overemphasis on the marginalized and often underplays the role of elites in organizing the broader nationalist struggles. Also, there were convergence in their movements. Okay, that was also ignored. So that's with the first unit, and in the next video we will be starting the second unit. So major social and religious movements in the 19th century. So that's it. Bye then. Happy learning. Thank you.